Have you ever wondered what the longest war in American history is? It's not the one you might think. It wasn't fought in Vietnam, Afghanistan, or Europe. It was fought right here, on American soil, for nearly 3 centuries. This is the story of the Native American Wars, a conflict often sidelined, misunderstood, and deliberately erased from our collective memory. This wasn't just one war, but a series of hundreds of conflicts, campaigns, and massacres that shaped the very foundation of the United States. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on this forgotten chapter of history to understand what really happened, and why it's more important than ever to remember. Before 1492, the Americas were not an empty wilderness. They were a vibrant continent, home to millions of people organized into thousands of distinct nations and tribes. From the complex urban centers of the Mississippian culture like Cahokia with its massive earthen mounds, to the sophisticated agricultural societies of the Southwest, and the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the Northeast, this land was a mosaic of languages, traditions, and political systems. These weren't scattered, primitive groups. They were established societies with deep connections to their ancestral lands, which they had cultivated and managed for millennia. Their worlds were rich with art, science, and spirituality, all intricately woven into the natural landscapes they called home. The arrival of European colonists marked the beginning of a cataclysmic shift. Initially, interactions were varied. There was trade, curiosity, and sometimes cooperation. But as colonial ambitions grew, so did the insatiable hunger for land. What followed was a relentless pattern of westward expansion, driven by concepts like manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the continent. This expansion was not a peaceful settlement of empty territory. It was a violent, systematic dispossession of native peoples from their ancestral homes. At the heart of this dispossession were treaties. Hundreds of them. The U.S. government signed over 370 treaties with native nations, legally recognizing them as sovereign entities. These treaties were supposed to establish boundaries, guarantee peace, and protect native rights to land and resources. But time and again, they were treated as temporary obstacles, not permanent agreements. As settlers, miners, and railroad companies pushed westward, the U.S. government would violate its own treaties, using military force or coercive new agreements to seize the very lands they had promised to protect forever. Each broken treaty was a betrayal, a clear signal that the promises of the United States were worthless, setting the stage for decades of conflict. This relentless pressure inevitably exploded into open warfare. The American Indian Wars were not a single continuous conflict, but a long, brutal series of engagements that spanned centuries and the entire continent. These weren't the sanitized battles we see in old westerns. They were brutal, desperate struggles for survival. Think of the Seminole Wars in Florida, where the tribe resisted removal for decades in the swamps. Or the fierce battles on the Great Plains, where tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fought to defend their way of life against the encroaching U.S. Army. These were wars characterized by scorched earth tactics, the destruction of villages, and the deliberate targeting of food sources, like the mass slaughter of the buffalo, to starve tribes into submission. The violence was relentless and unforgiving on a frontier defined by conflict. When military conquest proved too slow, the U.S. government turned to a policy of forced removal. The most infamous example is the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. Despite the Cherokee Nation winning a Supreme Court case that affirmed their sovereignty, President Andrew Jackson defied the court. The Cherokee, along with the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole peoples, were forced from their ancestral lands in the southeast and made to march over 1,000 miles to so-called Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. Thousands of men, women, and children perished from disease, starvation, and exposure along the way. This wasn't an isolated event. Similar forced removals happened across the country, from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Lakes. These were not just marshes. They were death marshes, designed to clear the land for white settlement. And where there was resistance, there were often massacres. Events like the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, where U.S. troops slaughtered over 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, who were living peacefully under the promise of U.S. protection. Or the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, where the 7th Cavalry killed hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children, effectively ending the major armed conflicts on the plains. These weren't battles. They were acts of terror intended to break the will of native resistance. They are dark, bloody stains on American history that are often ignored or downplayed. The war wasn't just fought with guns and soldiers, it was also a war on culture. The ultimate goal was assimilation, to erase Native identity entirely. This was brutally implemented through the Indian boarding school system, with the motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Children were forcibly taken from their families, sent to distant schools, stripped of their traditional clothing and had their hair cut. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages or practicing their spiritual beliefs, often under the threat of severe physical punishment. This systematic cultural destruction was a deliberate attempt to sever the connection between generations, to wipe out the very essence of what it meant to be native. The trauma from this era echoes through families and communities to this day. Yet, in the face of this overwhelming pressure, Native peoples never stopped resisting. This resistance produced some of the most remarkable leaders in history. Figures like Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader who forged a pan-tribal confederacy to resist American expansion in the early 1800s, or Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, the Lakota leaders whose strategic brilliance led to a major victory against the U.S. Army at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And there was Geronimo, the Apache warrior whose small band of fighters evaded thousands of U.S. and Mexican soldiers for years in the rugged Southwest. These leaders and countless others fought with incredible courage and determination not just for land, but for their people's right to exist. They are American heroes who deserve to be recognized. The consequences of these wars are not confined to the past. They are a living reality today. The forced relocation onto reservations, often on marginal, resource-poor land, created cycles of poverty, poor health outcomes, and social distress that persist. The loss of land and autonomy undermined traditional economies and governance structures. The historical trauma, passed down through generations, contributes to ongoing challenges, including mental and physical health disparities. The promises made in treaties regarding healthcare, education, and sovereignty are still at the center of legal and political battles today. This isn't ancient history. It's the root of contemporary issues facing Native American communities. So why is so much of this history unknown to the average American? For generations, it has been systematically minimized or erased from our textbooks and popular culture. The narrative we were taught was one of heroic pioneers and manifest destiny, where Native Americans were either depicted as noble savages destined to vanish or as violent obstacles to progress. The true scale of the violence, the broken treaties, and the centuries of resistance were simply left out of the story. This erasure wasn't an accident. It was necessary to create a simplified, more comfortable national myth. But this myth comes at the cost of truth and justice. Remembering this history is not about assigning guilt. It's about seeking truth. It's about understanding the full, complex, and often painful story of the United States. Acknowledging the atrocities of the past doesn't weaken a nation. It strengthens it by fostering a more honest understanding of who we are and how we got here. It allows us to honor the resilience of Native peoples and to recognize that their fight for sovereignty, for their land, and for their culture continues today. This forgotten war still matters because its legacy is all around us, and until we confront it, the promise of liberty and justice for all will remain incomplete. Thanks for watching, and if you found this important, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into history.